It's just a DLC, who cares, mate? The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom is upon us, people. And with it, a rather interesting, depending upon your definition of the word interesting, discourse surrounding the nature of Tears of the Kingdom has arisen. Is it a worthy sequel to Breath of the Wild, or is it just a glorified DLC? Well, I say let's just get right on into it, people. I'm struggling to stay awake. I'm being fueled simply off of these Korok videos I'm seeing and coffee. So let's get into this. Tears of the Kingdom. Is it a glorified DLC for Breath of the Wild? I think honestly, no. I mean, obviously no, based on the definition of the word, but we understand there's a difference between the literal form of an argument and the spiritual form of an argument. Essentially, the spiritual form of the argument that is being taken by some people is that Tears of the Kingdom does not iterate or innovate enough based on its predecessor Breath of the Wild to really warrant its own release, let alone at an increased price range of $70. And we'll get to the $70 in a future video, but I want to dispel this notion, at least from my perspective, that in order for a sequel to be seen as worthy, that it must completely change the game or replace the wheel and just be completely different to its predecessor, because I fundamentally disagree with that assessment. Heck, one of my favorite examples of a sequel to a game comes from the Zelda series. Majora's Mask, compared to Ocarina of Time. My favorite Zelda game of all time is Majora's Mask. Hands down, I love that game. And if it came out today, a lot of people would call it an asset flip, because a lot of assets and models and just overall set pieces were just ripped straight out of Ocarina of Time. Some people may say that's lazy. However, for me, I would argue it's a part of the charm. So long as you reutilize and retool those components from the original game into this new one and give them their own sense of identity and they feel like they belong and they don't feel out of place, I don't have a problem with it, so long as it adds to the overall experience. And in Majora's Mask, a game that, from my recollection, had barely any time for development, but managed to push out one of my favorite gameplay experiences of all time, when you look at Majora's Mask and Ocarina of Time next to each other, they are completely separate games. The look, the tone, the feel, the atmosphere, the gameplay mechanics, they're also fundamentally different from one another. But if you get hung up on these little contrivances, or these little arguments that can be sprung up about the nature of what it means to be a sequel or a DLC to a game, then in my opinion, you lose the full image. You lose the full picture that's trying to be painted before you. Because you can look at all the differences between Majora's Mask and Ocarina of Time and understand these are completely separate games. They just take place as a sequel to one another. Well, Majora's Mask is a sequel to Ocarina of Time, so it has some throughput in terms of its character models and stuff like that. However, the way they are utilized in Majora's Mask exudes this sense of recollection, this sense of familiarity, but because of the way of and nature of Majora's Mask, something feels a little bit off. But if you played Ocarina of Time before Majora's Mask, you'd be like, hey, this feels familiar to me. But it's still really different at the same time. I think there's a value to that feeling. And when we go from Breath of the Wild, one of the most revolutionary open-world games we've ever seen released because of the nature of how it tackles the open world, and we go to Tears of the Kingdom, a game that really, at the end of the day, relies upon a lot of the strengths of Breath of the Wild, but alters the formula in such a way to lean more into its strengths. What am I talking about? Okay, so, Fuse and Ultra Hand. These two mechanics, in my opinion, justify Tears of the Kingdom, because they fundamentally alter everything we play around with. They recontextualize all of Hyrule, which, sure, is largely the same and brought over from Breath of the Wild, but there are changes that have undergone for the world of Hyrule to where the world still feels different. However, on top of that, you also have those tools that I just mentioned, Ultra Hand, Fuse, and I'd also throw Recall and Ascend into the mix, to where the way you're interacting with the world is fundamentally different to where the world feels and plays differently to how it did in Breath of the Wild, which exudes and gives off this unique feeling for the game. To where, yes, it is a sequel, yes, it is still kind of the same world, but it has its own unique twist on it. The way you're interacting, the way you're viewing the world is different, and I think there's value to that. However, Tears of the Kingdom doesn't just stop there. You have the sky area, which again fundamentally changes how you interact with the ground floor of Hyrule. Why? Because you can float down, you can glide down, you can go from a very high place, build some kind of machine to soar you to someplace else if that's your choosing. And the sky areas, each of them are kind of, not as big as Hyrule, but they do feel big enough in their own right where they bring some value. You lose a lot of hours up there. And I really enjoy that element of the game design. How it freshens up the visual experience, freshens up the gameplay experience. And spoilers in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, good? Okay, the underground exists. My god, what a wonderfully designed piece of game. Where each of these 3 different sections of the map, the sky, the ground, and the underground, they all require different gameplay strategies, and just the overall way you look and view the game is so different to each other that they breed a sense of individuality, but also a sense of uniqueness from Breath of the Wild, where the game feels like a giant step in the right direction in almost every way, in my opinion. Fuse makes combat way less annoying due to the durability system. It's still there and still kind of annoying because of the durability. However, it smoothed it out a lot, in my opinion. But exploration, when you're in the underground, it's dark as hell down there. You can barely see anything, but it creates this cool, visual, unique aesthetic area down there. The mobs are just slightly different. You have different mechanics that you're contending with. You find these little rail depots full of materials that you can utilize to construct things to get you from point A to point B, using the bright bloom seeds, or whatever they're called, to create some kind of illumination in this area. It's a really cool visual effect, and one of the things I really like about Tears of the Kingdom is just how each of these different layers in the world feels fundamentally different to one another, just aesthetically. Because the sky is very bright, saturated, color-wise. You get down onto the ground level, and it's not as saturated as the sky, but it's still beautiful in its own right. Then you go to the underground, and everything is kind of like dull and muted. Shadows lurk everywhere, and it just feels ominous. And there's that feeling of being an ominous experience that I really treasure out of a Zelda game. I talked about this on stream, I believe, a day or two ago, where, in my opinion, Zelda's at its best when it leans fully into one of 2 categories. Either the sheer cartoony aspects like Link's Awakening or Wind Waker, and it just leans into that form of comedy and that highly saturated color aesthetic and cartoony art style and gameplay and humor. Or it goes the other direction, and it goes dark, macabre, it goes very, Majora's Mask, Twilight Princess. You may have run into the monster that's just a bunch of hands that are shadowy, that chase you, grab you, and throw you about the place. It's menacing. It's cool. It's a wonderful experience, and Zelda's able to bridge the gap, in a way, between those dark, ominous parts, but also the bright, cheery ones as well. It's a really unique visual that always keeps you on the edge of your seat for me. And as someone who does treasure aesthetic diversity in a game, because I get bored if I look at any one thing for too long in a game, that's really up my alley. It really is. Sure, the game, in a lot of ways, does feel like Breath of the Wild, but I don't think it's a bad thing. Breath of the Wild was a really beloved game by many people, myself included. Wasn't a perfect game for me or anything, but I really loved that game. And Tears of the Kingdom feels like an experience where it's just like, okay, we understand what made Breath of the Wild tick, what made people love and adore that game so much. How can we lean more into those elements? Lean more into player agency and non-linearity. Give people the tools to be able to make their own solutions to the puzzles we pose to them. It's a pure sandbox game, and there's a lot of value in that, in my opinion. So yeah, is The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom a glorified DLC or a full-blown sequel? I think obviously it's a sequel, in my opinion. However, I don't think feeling like your predecessor as a game has to be a bad thing. If the game did good things, lean into that. Don't just abandon them wholesale for the sake of innovation and the sake of change. Why would you do that? Take what worked, iterate on it, make it better, but retain that sense of identity. And that's what Tears of the Kingdom is doing. And that, in my opinion, is the best direction for it to have gone. Because there are systemic changes to the gameplay formula in Tears of the Kingdom that just lean into those strengths, in my opinion. And that has value to it. I don't think that should just be dismissed. And if you don't like the game, that's entirely fine. However, I would argue, if you don't enjoy the game, explain why. Because using reductive arguments like, it's just a glorified DLC, doesn't add to your argument or to your point. Bring up specifics. What is it you don't like about the formula? We can have an interesting conversation about stuff like that. But this is one of those moments on the internet where people may just not like a thing, and to express that dislike, they use arguments that just don't make sense instead of just bringing up actual constructive criticism. So I'm going to end the video there for today. Thank you all for tuning in. My pleasure making the video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out and help support future content, and I greatly appreciate it. Stay safe, everybody. Have a great day. Hit the bell icon to be notified when I upload in the future. Stay safe. Have a great day. Go play some video games if you can. As always, I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye, everybody, until we meet again.